Hare Krishna. Good morning, dear devotees from Sridham Mayapur. My name is Madhavananda Das, and this is our regular adventures in Srimad Bhagavatam. Today we're going to speak something more, the 17th part about the meeting in Kurukshetra, and we're still speaking about what happened in Mathura and the exchanges, the letters that Krishna sent to Mother Yashoda and to his friends. We'll continue with that discussion today, just after a few prayers. Gauragraganya gana gocha goloruharam Gauranga gudatama gopyara kopa briksham Gopala gada ratidam yati singha gora Govinda deshi kavaram satatam namami Narayanam namaskrityam naramschaiva narotamam Devim saraswatim vyasam tato jayam udirayat Vede ramayaneshchaiva purane bharate tata Adavante chamadye cha hari sarvatra giyate Mukam karoti vachalam pangum langayate girim Yat kripa tamaham vande shigurum dinataranam Paramananda madhavam Paramananda he madhava Padunga luchi makaranda Se makaranda panakori Anande bolo hari hari Harinkaname bandhavela Parikori be chakadola Se chakadolanka padaye Manamo rahu nirantare Manamo nirantare rahu Ha Krishna, Boli Jiva Jao. Ha Krishna, Boli Jao Jiva. Moteu Radha Dava. Moteu Radha Dava. Moteu Radha Dava. Dharma projita kaita vota paramonya matsranam satam vidyam vastavamatta vastu shivadam chapa chayam mulanam Srimad Bhagavate Mahamune Krite Kim Va Parayashvara Sadyo Hridyavarudhyate Tukatibishu Shushabhistakshanad Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Good morning, dear devotees. So we're speaking more about Krishna's departure from Vrindavan and how that happened and his heartbreaking conversation with Nanda Maharaj. So Krishna, in our last description, he sent a letter to Mother Yashoda, and Nanda Maharaj, seeing their exchange with Mother Yashoda, he then asked Krishna, well, what about your friends? What are they supposed to do? With tears in his eyes, he said, how will your friends maintain their lives? They depend so much on you. And then Krishna replied to his father. He said that in the same way that my mother will see me, the spurti, but although my mother, she thinks it's just a dream, but it's not. My friends who are filled with this pranaya, this loving affection for me, they'll also see me. And then Nanda Maharaj, he asked Krishna, then said, what about the cows? Will they also be able to directly hear you and see you? And then Krishna said, although they'll see my spurti, and that'll relieve the cows of some suffering, I'll use another means to produce external awareness of the cows, because the cows operate mainly by smell and sound. And they also discern form. So, my friend Stoka Krishna, he should dress himself in my cloth, which smells like me, and he should play the flute. And Subal should dress in Balaram's blue cloth and take his horn, and they should sit among the cows. And the fortunate animals and trees of the forest also, they'll see my Spurti. In Vrindavan, everyone sees Krishna. And Nanda Maharaj says, well, what about the servants? The Sudras and the Abhiras, the young boys of Krishna's servants. He said, what about them? And Krishna, with tears in his eyes, he said, since they all have affection like my friends and others, they'll also attain service by following the elders, and they'll be praiseworthy. And then Krishna instructed Madhu Mangal. Now it's interesting because different things are said about Madhu Mangal. We may visit with Madhu Mangal a little bit later on more. But Jiva Goswami and Gopal Champu tells Madhu Mangal that you should also go. You'll be my representative. And you should serve Purnamasi and be there for the boys and that. Whereas Rupa Goswami in his Lalita Madhav describes that Madhu Mangal is the son of Sandapani Muni, who Krishna went to rescue. And later Madhu Mangal accompanies Krishna to Dwarka. So then Krishna gave different gifts to Stoka Krishna and Subal. He presented with them not just a birthday cake or something like that, but he gave them his own clothing that had the scent of his body. And then he decorated them personally with his own ornaments. And then he took permission to remain there. And then he brought in the Brahmins of Mathura who were standing outside during that meeting. And he sent them to inform the members of the Yadu dynasty. And then at that time, Vasudeva and Ugrasen and others came there. They were very, very happy. And Krishna worshipped them with different articles and followed after them. And they entered into Mathura while discussing amongst themselves. And then at that time, we heard from the Harivamsa Purana how Kamsa had taken forcibly so many different items from the Brijbasis who went there to see the wrestling match. Krishna returned those items that Kamsa had taken away from them. And Krishna was afraid of his agitation because of his closeness to the Brijbasis. So to return those gifts, to return those items, he'd gone out to the camp where the Brijbasis were staying. But then he took leave of Nanda Maharaj and the elders, and he returned again to the city. And Balaram at that time became very confused. Balaram, seeing Krishna going back to Mathura, Balaram turned to follow Krishna. But then, seeing Nanda Maharaj in the Brijbasis, he turned to follow them, to be with them. And then seeing Krishna going, Balaram became very, very confused. And finally he followed Krishna. In the 45th chapter, the 10th canto, text 24, this is described a little more. Evam santavyaya bhagavan nandam swabrajam achyuta vasu lankara kupya dhayar arhayam asasadaram. That Krishna consoled Nanda Maharaj and the other Brijbasi men. He spoke, santavya means consoling words. Krishna spoke to them different nice words and things. And then he gave them different gifts. And what did he give them? Some basa, some clothing, some alankar, some jewelry, some different kupya, which means vessels that are like made out of bell metal and like that. And Vishwanath says in his commentary that Krishna was consoling Nanda Maharaj and saying, don't worry about me staying here in Mathura. It's just going to be a few more days. And my mind is always thinking about Vrindavan. I'm only staying here because these members of the Yadu dynasty, they have some desire, but I really want to be in Vrindavan. Jiva Goswami in Laghu Vaishnav Toshani describes that Krishna was able to console Nanda Maharaj because he was Bhagavan, as described in this verse. Santavya Bhagavan. Because he's Bhagavan, he's God, therefore his Santavya, he was able to console him. And because he was the son of Nanda Maharaj, Nanda Maharaj could take consolation that Krishna was going to fulfill his promise to return. And Krishna worshipped them, Jiva Goswami says, with gifts to instill faith in them and that promise. And Krishna also consoled all the other persons who had accompanied him and gave them gifts. And he sent messages to Mother Yashoda and others in Braj. And he also sent different gifts for them, because that's what you do when you go to the big city, right? If you're living in Russia, in the countryside, and you've never been to the big city, and one time you go to Moscow, and you stay there for 2 weeks or something, and then you return to your village, you have to bring something. You have to bring some big city stuff for them. Because everybody in the village, they dress in a very simple way. But the people in the city, they dress in really fancy dress. So you bring some fancy dress for them. You bring some fancy articles. We brought a blender for you, or this or that. So in the same way, Krishna was bringing different special items. And Jiva Goswami in particular mentions they sent some bell metal utensils for milking the cows. And he also sent some nice vehicles and different things. And Jiva Goswami says that although the residents of Vrindavan already had all kinds of wealth, because these were given with affection by Krishna, they accepted those things. And then Krishna worshipped Nanda Maharaj and the others respectfully. And he brought Vasudeva and Ugrasena and had them also do that worship. Sanatana Goswami in his Brihad Vaishnav Toshani says that although Nanda Maharaj had been instructed to return, Krishna had promised to return to Vrindavan. And Nanda Maharaj began crying and crying. And he embraced Krishna very tightly. And there were sounds of pain coming from him. And he was stumbling, and sometimes he was fainting. And one by one, Krishna embraced each of the cowherd boys who were there, and Krishna began crying with love. Krishna was crying, and all the boys were crying. And then Krishna left with Vasudeva and Ugrasena. And Nanda Maharaj was thinking to himself, what will I do? How can I speak to Mother Yashoda? How will you be able to maintain your life without Krishna? And then Krishna, he turned to Balaram, and he spoke something to him. And Nanda Maharaj told Balaram, Brajeshvaras tu pralina manastayam api jivan muktavad eva sanskara saridam jagada vatsa nijanuja vatsala sakevlataya manobhalam hasyati tasmadanujam tam evano yahi iti. Although he was stunned, still Nanda Maharaj spoke to Krishna, to Balaram, and he said, my dear child, who's very dear to my son, now that we're all alone, our life heirs have given up our bodies, and therefore you should follow your brother. And then Krishna and Balaram, they went to a private place to speak, and Krishna encouraged Balaram that you should go to Vrindavan, and Balaram said, I can't, I'm going to die. I have to stay with you. And then finally, Jiva Goswami says that Krishna came back to see Nanda Maharaj, and he says there, Atta Shri Krishna's cha, touch charna vindam siddhasa. Siddhasa means the head. And Krishna came there, and he put his head on Nanda Maharaj's feet. And then sanirvedyam nivetavan. Krishna began to speak this from his heart. And he told Nanda Maharaj, Ahaha vahalamantum jantar esha pralapi rachitama chita tata kshantum arhasatvam eva katamapi nijam angam vyadina dukadam shat tadapi nahi tad angi chaktum itchet kadapi. With his head on the feet of Nanda Maharaj, Krishna cried. And he said, "Oh, my dear father, please forgive me." He said, I'm behaving in a way which is not even human. I'm acting like an animal. I'm speaking all kinds of nonsense. I'm cheating my father. I'm committing a very great offense to you. Mm-hmm. He says, "But my dear father, katam api nijam angam. Vyadina dukadam shat." Although someone's own limb of the body may give pain, you may hit your hand with a hammer, and that hand causes you a lot of pain. He says, still, tadapi nahi tadangi, chaktam, itchet kadapi. Chaktam means to give up. Still, you don't want to cut off your hand. In other words, Krishna is telling his father that although I've caused you so much pain, you have to forgive me because I'm still your son. And Nanda Maharaj, tears began flowing down his face. And he embraced Krishna. And everyone who was there, their hair stood on end out of deep bliss. And at that time, Jiva Goswami says that Chalantam Subalam Balanauja, Krishna engaged his friend Subal, who had come to Mathura, with a message to the gopis. Satyam Sanjaja Yusmani Tatmaranuga Pranana Nispramana Dharmyam menasti kimchit tarapisa vayasa sriyatam nivedyam yusmakam yati setur moyi ratir atula satu mam hripayanti tatulya sakti riktam hunattatanum akaron nashmi durada kadapi. Krishna speaks in a very, very heartfelt way here to the gopis. He says, Satyam, it's true. Yes, I accept. The Santyad Yushman, Santyaja means gave you up. Yusman, you. I gave you up. It's true. Although, Niyatamad Anuga Pranana Nispramana, your life heirs are following after me, and you left your bodies without a trace. He says, Dharmam nanasti, I have no dharma. It's true. But my dear friends, he addresses them as Vyasa, my dear friends, Shriyatamam Nivedyam, please listen to my Nivedya, my submissive statement. This is a message that Krishna sent with Subal. Yusmakam yati setur mayi ratir atula. Your rati, your incomparable love, which rati atula means it's incomparable. Satumam hripayanti, it breaks all types of conventions. And that love shames me. Because Krishna is speaking in a very humble way to the gopis. Yes, it's true. I gave you, I'm not going to argue with you. I'm guilty. And just like sometimes people in India, they come before the deity and they tug on their ears, or they slap their cheeks. Yes, punish me. I accept my punishment. And Krishna is admitting to them, my love for you is much weaker than your love. And Krishna says, it makes me want to hide before you. But you should understand that nasmi dura kadapi, I'm never very far away from you. Puryam ashyam yarasmi pakatam apihi tam hanta kuryam katam tat kim tu chaya sadriksha sputamiha varet tat tu swasena nityam. Avesho yatta yasha spuratisa niyatam tatta bhakti swayam yat sputim swam soyamasmitya anubhajati yatta tena nanyena tatvat. Krishna said again, yes, I understand, it's true. I can't hide the fact. It's a fact. I'm in Mathura. If you may say, if you really loved us, why did you leave? Why did you go? Yes, it's a fact. Krishna says, Satyam Santyadra Yusman, yes, I gave you up. Yes, I'm in Mathura. He said, but you should understand that my form here, Kim Chaya Sadriksha Sputam, it's just like a shadow. But the real form, my real self, is always in Vrindavan. He says that you should understand the reality is I'm in Vrindavan. And this form in Mathura is just a shadow. And what you see, Avesha Yata Yesha Spurati, that Spurti that you see in Vrindavan, it's more real than the form which is here in Mathura. And then Krishna wrote a letter to Chandravali. Soma be darsha ratravapini jaruchi bi purnima brantitastvam madvishlesha jarati prati navamadasa drivasangi yad asihi tarhi tvam angakanti spuradasita mani sachaya vyapta sarva soham sislesha tad vinimita dasaya yatra chittam jagashta. Chandravali, he said, you should understand that coming outside in Mathura and mistaking that moon to be your body, which is there, I fainted from the fever of separation. And you should understand that I'm embracing you always. And he says, hey Lalita, you met me on the edge of the forest. Pali, you were ready to receiving Vishaka. You introduced me to Radha. You thought that all these things were just spurtis, were false, but it's not true. It really happened. He says, Padma Bhadra Saibya. When you were rolling around on the ground near that tamal tree out of separation from me, I was there. I know about it. And I came close and I embraced your body. And then some old angry woman came somewhere and started shouting at me. Don't doubt, it's real. And then Krishna revealed his letter to Srimati Radharani. Anye Yushila Radhe Mama Pura Gamanasputti Sanjata Murtyam Tvam Malingyanuchu Bum Girivanam Anayam Tat Katam Vyasmaras Tvam Tatragyam Yata Sarvaha Kala Kala Virutam Yarhi Chakrustadanim Tatravam Naha Yatasvam Pritakad Abagato Nasmarasheva Tachcha. She said, Krishna said, Radha, when I revealed that I would go to Mathura, you fainted. And I embraced you, I kissed you, and I led you to the forest and to the mountain. How can you forget that? And then when the women came there, we fled in different directions. Don't you remember that? And then Krishna said, Swapne yadvarike tvam mama sayanam ihapya shrita rajapuryam. Swapna yadvarike. Don't think it's a swapna, it's a dream. The Shayana Ihapi Ashrita Rajapuryam, that you were laying on my bed in Mathura sleeping. It's not a dream. Swapnastanasti nunam parimalitam abud tadvaya tasya vasa. Because the sheet has the fragrance of your body there. And he says, today, a blind man with a slight smile on his face is now enjoying the fragrance of the crushed jewel of all women, a fragrance which is meant to anoint my body. And he shakes his head very slightly in astonishment. So Krishna sent these letters. And Nanda Maharaj, he returned to the camp where the Brajbasis were staying because he'd followed Krishna out some distance and was speaking with them. And Nanda Maharaj wasn't even able to speak to them. He just stood there and he cried. And then finally, with a choked voice, he indicated that we should get ready to return to Vrindavan. And when the Brajbasi men who were there and the boys heard the words of Nanda Maharaj, they all became stunned and they couldn't move. And then Nanda Maharaj, with a choked voice, he says, no, Krishna's promised. He said, Ayasya, Ayasya, that I'm going to return to Vrindavan. And Krishna's instructed that we should all return, that we should take care of Yashoda, we should take care of the cows. At that time, Krishna came there, and Krishna began crying. And Nanda Maharaj embraced Krishna. And Krishna, crying and crying, fell at the feet of Nanda Maharaj and said, Bappa, you have to return. What about mother? And then Nanda Maharaj, crying and sobbing, went to the chariot. But he couldn't get into the chariot. He turned around and he ran back to Krishna and embraced him again. And Krishna again fell at his father's feet and said, Father, please forgive me. I'm such an offender. But Father, you have to return from mother. And again, Nanda Maharaj started for the chariot. And again, before getting on the chariot, he thought, how can I leave Krishna? He stopped and he turned around and ran back again. And again this would happen. And again, Nanda Maharaj would fall on the ground unconscious. And Krishna would run to him and embrace him, Father. And Nanda Maharaj would regain external consciousness and again embrace Krishna. And again Krishna, crying, told his father, you have to return to mother. And finally Nanda Maharaj, crying and looking back at Krishna, who was standing there and crying and looking at his father. Nanda Maharaj began to leave Vrindavan and began to leave Mathura for Vrindavan. At that time, Balaram was standing there and seeing his friends and his father, Nanda Maharaj, leaving. Balaram began to follow them, but then Balaram stopped and he looked back at Krishna. And Balaram became stunned. And then Balaram started going back to Krishna. And then he stopped again and looked back at Nanda Maharaj and the boys, and seeing him leaving, Balaram started running after them. Then he stopped. And Balaram turned around. And then Balaram began sobbing, and he ran back to Krishna. The Bhagavatam describes, Ityuktasto parisvajya Nanda pranaya vivala. That Nanda Maharaj pranaya vivala, he became overwhelmed with affection, hearing Krishna's words. And at that time, Purayanam Ashubir Netri Sahagopa Brajam Yayo. He embraced Krishna and Balaram. And then his eyes full of tears, Ashubir Netri Gopar Brajam Yayo. He started out for Vrindavan. But Jiva Goswami in Gopal Champu, he says that before he left Mathura, Nanda Maharaj did one last thing. He sent a message to his older brothers, Upananda and others who were waiting for them in Vrindavan, to tell them that we're going to arrive. And that news, because Nanda Maharaj didn't want to shock them, Nanda Maharaj just instructed that something very, very intolerable has happened. There in Vrindavan, Upananda and others, they were all gathered together, and they were waiting in a kind of almost festive way, waiting for Krishna's arrival. And they got this message from Nanda Maharaj, and they thought, what is he saying? What does this mean? And Upananda and the others, they couldn't accept it. Mother Yashoda and some of the gopis were standing a little ways apart, and that message came, but it fell, as we may say in English, on deaf ears. The residents of Vrindavan couldn't accept it. They couldn't even conceive of that message. So we'll return again with our discussion on Friday about this subject matter. And we'll hear something very esoteric from the purports of Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, where he explains why it is that Krishna left the residents of Vrindavan, and actually how it is that Krishna returned. He directly returned with Nanda Maharaj and the boys. But on the other hand, he also didn't return. We'll discuss that very esoteric topic in our next session. I want to thank all the devotees who have been taking part, Madhupati Prabhu, and my apologies to everyone for starting so late today, Natalia, Brajabanita. If anyone has any reflections or comments, questions, this is the time for them now. And Madhupati Prabhu said, was Krishna's letter read aloud to be heard by all present? Or were they written and kept confidential? Well, in an appropriate way, some of the letters were public and some of the letters were private. The letters which Krishna sent with Subal for Radharani and the gopis, those were private. They weren't read out amongst everyone else. But Jiva Goswami describes later on in Gopal Champu that Krishna was sending letters also from Dwarka. And there were different types of letters. Some of those were read just for the cowherd boys. And some of those, especially the letters to Nanda Maharaj and Mother Yashoda, those were letters. Mother Yashoda's letter here was a private one, but he says that the letter to Nanda Maharaj and this letter which Nanda Maharaj sent to Upananda and others, those were publicly read out. So, if there's any other comments online, we can take that. Otherwise, Anapayani, do you have any reflections?
I have a question about this letter from Nanda Maharaj to his elder brother. So what exactly does he said in it? He kind of warned them that he will not come back with Krishna, or what exactly?
Jiva Goswami doesn't say that. All that Jiva Goswami says is that there's some intolerable news. And from that we can understand that it's intolerable to speak. And Nanda Maharaj can't even say it. It's just so painful, so terrible that he can't even tolerate writing this thing. Okay? Something else you have also?
No, I don't really have so many things to say, but I just was impressed how about this moment when Krishna and Nanda Maharaj have to leave, and Gopas are there, and Balaram and Krishna and Nanda Maharaj, he's sitting in the chariot, and then he coming back to Krishna, and Krishna falling at his feet, and this is really a special moment which shows emotions of devotees and Krishna at that moment.
It's also a special kind of mercy for the residents of Mathura.
To watch this.
Because they're able to see this. Just as Jiva Goswami, we commented earlier, a few days ago, how Jiva Goswami says that it was by the association of Nanda Maharaj that Vasudeva realized his love for Krishna, attained that love. Brinda Sundari Mataji is saying, greetings from Denver, that their family is listening as they wind down the evening. Thank you very much for taking part. We really appreciate that. I hope the devotees there get something from it. I miss Denver. I grew up in Colorado Springs, and we were in charge of the Boulder Preaching Center many years ago, and we used to come once a week and dress the deities and Radha Govinda and Goni Tai there, and I hope everything's well there in Denver, Colorado. So thank you all very much. We'll be back again on Friday. Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Samaveda Bhakta Binda ki jai, Gaur Prem Anandi Hari Hari Bol.